When the HOA sent me a formal notice demanding I paint my fence a more pleasing shade, I laughed. It was just a fence. What more did they want? But when they threatened daily fines and called it a visual blight, something snapped inside me. They wanted pretty? Fine. I gave them spectacular. I turned my ordinary backyard fence into a jaw-dropping $20,000 modern art installation that had the entire neighborhood buzzing, the HOA fuming, and news crews parked on my street. But as the art world praised my bold, creative statement, the HOA's reaction turned dark, fast. It all began with a beige fence, just a simple, neutral-colored wooden fence that had stood quietly around my backyard for 4 years. I had painted it myself, following the HOA's approved list of earth tone colors. I even got it signed off by the compliance officer at the time. There were no issues, until a new HOA board took over, and suddenly, everything changed. One crisp Monday morning, I found a letter tucked inside my mailbox, sealed with the HOA's logo like it was some official government document. It read, "Your fence color has been deemed non-compliant with current community aesthetic standards. Please repaint your fence within 14 days to avoid fines." I read it 3 times. Sure, I was misunderstanding something. Non-compliant? The paint hadn't changed. The fence hadn't changed. Only the HOA board had. Confused but curious, I walked the perimeter of my yard, trying to see what they were talking about. Sure, the color had faded a bit from sun and weather, but that's what wood does. It was still very clearly a soft beige, hardly an eyesore. But apparently it didn't meet the new board's interpretation of visually harmonious tones. That phrase alone made me laugh. When I contacted the HOA office to clarify, I was met with a cold, robotic voice on the other end. The current board has updated the interpretation of acceptable palette tones. Your color falls outside of the approved shade range. I asked what the new range was. They emailed me a PDF that looked like a swatch book from a luxury interior design catalog. It listed 11 shades, 9 of which looked nearly identical to the naked eye. And there it was in bold. Only these approved colors may be used for exterior wood structures. Any deviation will result in a formal violation notice. I wasn't the only one targeted. That week, I learned that at least 5 other homes on my block had received similar letters. One neighbor had just finished repainting his fence last summer, same color as mine, and now he was being forced to repaint again, or face $100 per day fines. Another woman cried during our neighborhood meeting as she explained how her husband had passed away 2 months ago, and she couldn't afford to hire someone to do the work herself. The board offered no compassion. They simply said, "Compliance isn't optional." What struck me most wasn't the rule itself. It was the sheer pettiness and aggression with which it was enforced. One neighbor told me she saw a board member walking around with color swatches in hand, crouching beside fences to compare them like some kind of HOA detective. Another reported seeing them take photos of driveways and siding from behind bushes. It was like living under surveillance, all in the name of aesthetic consistency. The board's president, Ms. Nancy Little, had taken the lead on this new initiative. Rumor had it that she used to be an interior designer. Suddenly, her need for uniformity and perfect presentation made sense. She believed the neighborhood needed to look like a glossy magazine spread, and any deviation, no matter how minor, was unacceptable. Her followers on the board backed her up like a little HOA cult. To make matters worse, during a neighborhood walkthrough, one of the board members made a snide remark directly to me. Some homeowners just don't understand the importance of visual harmony. I smiled, but inside, I was boiling. My fence wasn't graffiti, it wasn't broken, it wasn't even bright or bold. But it wasn't their chosen shade of tan, and that was enough. There was a culture of fear spreading. Neighbors whispered about who might be targeted next. One elderly couple quietly painted their entire fence in 3 days, even though they could barely lift the paint cans, just to avoid confrontation. Another neighbor gave in after one letter, hiring a contractor to repaint everything in the middle of the week. Everyone was complying, not because they agreed, but because they were exhausted. I began to notice something else, too. The houses of the board members? Not a single one of them had been cited for any violations. Their fences looked immaculate, but I knew for a fact one of them had used a color that wasn't on the approved palette. But there were no letters in their mailboxes, no fines threatened, no pressure applied. It was selective enforcement, and it stunk of elitism. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about community standards. It was about control, power, intimidation, and I was done being polite. If they wanted pleasing and visually harmonious, I'd give it to them. But it wouldn't be what they expected. They wanted to treat my property like a coloring book they could control? Fine. I'd use my fence as a canvas, and I'd make it unforgettable. They thought they were enforcing order. But they had just triggered the start of something far more powerful, a creative rebellion they couldn't anticipate, and definitely couldn't stop. The violation notice was no longer just a letter in my mailbox. It became a symbol of everything wrong with our HOA. Delivered in a heavy cream envelope, the letter came with a tone so condescending it might as well have been handwritten by the HOA president herself. It read like a threat. I had 14 days to repaint my fence or face a $100 per day fine until it met community visual standards. No wiggle room, no appeal process, no grace period. The most infuriating part wasn't even the fine. It was the arrogance. The way they assumed I'd comply, no questions asked, just like the others had. There was a paragraph that stood out, bolded in black ink. Continued non-compliance may result in additional legal remedies, including liens. It was a fence, not a crime scene. But they spoke like I'd committed treason. 3 days after receiving the letter, I looked out the window and saw a familiar figure on my property. A board member, Frank, a retired school principal turned neighborhood enforcer, was standing in my backyard with a measuring tape and a clipboard. He didn't knock, didn't announce himself, just strutted onto my land like he owned it. When I confronted him, he casually muttered, "Just checking for accuracy. You've got until next Thursday." I felt violated. Who were these people to walk onto my land without permission? To treat me like a delinquent in my own home? That night, I sat on my back porch, seething, replaying the day's events in my head. That's when I remembered what I overheard during the last HOA meeting. Nancy, the board president, sipping her lemon water and murmuring smugly to one of her lackeys, "People like him always give up eventually. They just need pressure." That was it. That sentence flipped a switch inside me. I realized they weren't just enforcing rules. They were pushing people around because they believed they could. They thought their title gave them power. They thought fear was a good motivator. They weren't running a neighborhood. They were running a silent regime. That's when I decided I wouldn't repaint my fence. I'd repurpose it. The idea came slowly, sparked by anger and shaped by something deeper, a desire to reclaim what was mine, not with fists or fury, but with something they'd never expect: creativity. I spent hours that night online looking up street artists, public installations, even municipal art ordinances. I discovered entire movements, people who turned bland, rigid spaces into powerful statements with nothing but color, imagination, and courage. I found murals that told stories, sculptures that stood as protest, walls that carried voices louder than any bullhorn. And suddenly, my little fence wasn't just a fence anymore. It was a canvas, my canvas. The next day, I bought a sketchbook. I started brainstorming. I thought about what would make an impact without crossing legal lines. I wasn't about to vandalize my own property. I wanted to do everything within the rules, but with a twist so bold the board would have no idea how to respond. I envisioned something whimsical, colorful, and undeniably artistic, something that couldn't be written off as non-compliant without exposing their true motives. That's when the idea hit me. I'd turn the fence into a full-blown art installation. But not just any art. I wanted it to tell a story about conformity, about silent control, about how beauty doesn't fit in a checklist or a swatch book. I imagined ivy-like paint vines creeping across the panels, birds mid-flight, feathers cascading across wooden slats, abstract shapes blending into powerful imagery, shackled hands breaking free, eyes opening wide, symbols of rebellion and freedom in layered detail. I wanted every inch of that wood to speak. I called up a local muralist I found through an art collective online. He was known for transforming fences and alleyways into community murals. We talked for hours. I told him about the HOA, about the letter, about the threat, about the smug comment. He laughed and said, "Man, they picked the wrong guy to mess with." I agreed. We made a plan. I'd supply the fence. He'd bring the vision to life. I filed for an art permit through the city, not something usually required for private property, but I wanted to be extra careful. If the HOA tried to accuse me of illegal painting or graffiti, I'd be ready with paperwork, photos, and city approval in hand. I even reached out to a lawyer just in case, and learned that as long as the artwork was on my side of the fence and didn't depict anything obscene or offensive, the HOA would have a hard time making a legal case. Meanwhile, I kept quiet, didn't respond to the violation letter, didn't repaint a thing. Let them believe I was dragging my feet. Let them prepare their next fine. All the while, behind the scenes, something incredible was brewing. I wasn't just fighting back, I was building something bigger than a fence. I was crafting a message, one they couldn't erase with a paintbrush or silence with a fine. This wasn't just my rebellion anymore. It was about standing up, with color, with art, with fire in my chest. And I couldn't wait to watch their jaws drop. The planning phase became a mission. Not just a way to clap back at the HOA, but a full-scale act of creative resistance that would live long past their petty notice. I began by mapping out the fence, every panel, every inch of wood that had once seemed so ordinary. Now each slat felt like a blank page, a space waiting to be filled with color, movement, and meaning. This wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about symbolism. I dug into research like a student prepping for the biggest thesis of their life. I looked into historical public art movements, especially those born out of protest. I studied how muralists embedded layers of meaning into their work, how subtle references, metaphors, and symbolism could deliver a message that was both beautiful and impossible to ignore. My fence wasn't going to be a simple coat of paint. It was going to speak volumes. The first sketches I made were clumsy. I'm no artist, but I needed to get the ideas out of my head. I drew towering trees with roots that extended into clenched fists. I sketched birds breaking free from cages, their wings formed from fractured chains. I envisioned hands reaching upward, passing through layers of barbed wire that faded into clouds. Freedom, resistance, beauty in rebellion. These were the ideas I wanted to breathe into the wood. Knowing my own limitations, I reached out to a local artist collective I'd discovered through an underground art forum. Their work had transformed forgotten alleyways and condemned buildings into vibrant spaces that drew people from across the city. I sent them a long message explaining what had happened, why I was doing this, and what I hoped to accomplish. I included photos of the fence, scans of my sketches, and even a copy of the HOA's violation letter. 2 days later, I got a reply. They loved it. The collective, called Ink Root, specialized in socially charged public artwork. A few of their members came by for a site visit. We walked the length of the fence, talked through ideas, and brainstormed ways to blend emotion with community relevance. They suggested incorporating historical nods to freedom of speech, subtle references to landmark civil liberties cases, and local neighborhood folklore that could unite art with identity. One artist, a soft-spoken woman named Lena, suggested we use layered paint techniques to make certain parts of the mural only visible in sunlight. Like truth, she said. Another, a sculptor named Javi, proposed embedding small ceramic details, hidden butterflies, miniature hands, and mosaic eyes into the structure itself. It was ambitious, it was bold, and it was exactly what I wanted. Of course, none of this would come cheap. The collective gave me a rough estimate, around $18,000, possibly more if we added sculptural elements or interactive features. I didn't flinch. I'd already made peace with the cost. This was no longer a home improvement project. It was an investment in defiance, a declaration I was more than just another homeowner playing by arbitrary rules. I pulled funds from savings, paused a few personal luxuries, even took on a couple of freelance contracts to close the gap. Every dollar I spent felt like a brick in the wall between me and their control. I was building my own kind of freedom, one stroke at a time. Once the artists were on board, things moved fast. Supplies were delivered: scaffolding, primer, spray paints, brushes of every size, sealants, weatherproofing tools. My backyard looked like the set of an indie film, but the energy was electric. Artists came in waves. Some worked in silence, headphones on, others sang while they painted. My once quiet yard filled with laughter, color, and the sharp scent of aerosol and fresh paint. The mural began to take shape. Bold colors exploded across the panels. Giant symbolic figures emerged, wings stretching, flames rising, locks shattering. Some pieces were abstract, some hyper-realistic. There were layers to everything. You couldn't look at the fence just once and understand it. You had to stand there, walk alongside it, take it in section by section. It demanded attention, and people gave it. Neighbors who had never spoken to me before started pausing during their morning walks, watching the transformation. Some brought coffee for the artists. A few snapped photos whispering about time someone stood up to them. I even noticed cars slowing down as they drove past the house, windows rolled down, kids pointing in wonder. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. A few HOA loyalists kept their distance, faces stiff and disapproving. One of them, a man named Greg, circled the block twice a day, always with his phone out, probably documenting the process, hoping to find a reason to report me. But I wasn't worried. Everything was documented. Every artist had a signed release. The city permit was approved. And more importantly, every inch of that artwork was mine. By the time the mural reached its halfway point, it was already stirring conversations. A local blogger featured it in a neighborhood art watch post. Someone from the city's cultural affairs office reached out to ask if I'd consider submitting it for a public art award. Even the mailman told me it was the most badass fence he'd ever seen. It wasn't finished yet, but the message was already echoing louder than any fine or letter ever could. This was no longer just about the HOA. This was about reclaiming space, about showing every neighbor watching from behind curtains that there's more than one way to fight back. And we were only just getting started. When the final stroke of paint dried, the transformation was nothing short of astonishing. My once plain, regulation brown fence had become a masterpiece that wrapped around my property like a visual symphony, loud, colorful, unapologetic. From the vibrant hues to the fine details hidden within the layers, the fence was more than a surface. It had become a story, a conversation piece, a symbol. And the moment it was finished, it felt like the whole neighborhood took notice. People began showing up. First, it was just a few curious passers-by, neighbors who would slow down during their walks, subtly glancing at the panels before continuing on. Then came the ones who weren't subtle at all. They stopped right in front of my yard, sometimes for several minutes, taking in every inch of the mural. Some took selfies. Others walked the length of the fence as if they were touring a museum exhibit. I even saw a few kids tugging their parents over to point at the mosaic butterflies hidden within the patterns. A local lifestyle blogger who focused on street art somehow caught wind of it, probably from one of the many photos that had started to pop up on social media. They published a glowing feature titled "Suburbia Gets a Splash of Revolution," which described the mural as a gutsy blend of protest and public art and called me the Banksy of gated communities. It was a little over the top, but I couldn't deny the buzz felt good. Then things took a turn I didn't see coming. A gallery owner from downtown reached out to me through Instagram. He said he loved the work, asked if I'd consider exhibiting a few sections of the mural, or perhaps doing a gallery talk with the artists who collaborated. I laughed at the idea initially, me speaking at an art gallery. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about art anymore. It was about expression in a place where expression had been smothered for years by the same beige tones and manicured hedges. It was about telling people they could stand out and still belong. But of course, the HOA didn't see it that way. Exactly 2 days after the mural's completion, I received another official letter, hand-delivered by one of the HOA board members with all the flair of a court summons. This time, the violation wasn't just about unauthorized color changes. It accused me of installing unauthorized public signage, violating aesthetic consistency clauses, and, get this, causing undue distraction to pedestrians and motorists. They demanded the immediate removal of the mural and threatened fines that would escalate weekly until compliance was confirmed. The irony was laughable. First, they demanded I paint my fence. Now that I had, in a way they didn't expect, they wanted to erase it entirely. But I wasn't backing down. Not this time. I sat down with the bylaws again, this time reading through every single line with the precision of a lawyer prepping for a deposition. It was tedious, but it paid off. In Section 7B-4 of the HOA Handbook, hidden in vague legal language, was a clause that permitted artistic installations and decorative enhancements, so long as they did not include offensive language or obstruct visibility for traffic or safety personnel. There was no mention of color restrictions, no specifications about style, no requirement to seek approval from the board unless the installation included signage or advertisements. What I had done, technically, was entirely within the rules. They'd just never expected anyone to interpret the rules with such creativity. I drafted a response. It was firm, polite, and legally airtight. I included high-resolution photos of the mural, a copy of the bylaws with the relevant clause highlighted, and a list of supporting neighbors who had signed a statement claiming the artwork added cultural and aesthetic value to the community. I even tossed in a few screenshots from social media posts praising the installation. Then, I delivered the packet, personally, to the HOA office. The next few days were tense. I saw the board members huddling near the community center, holding their phones, glancing at my property. Greg, the most outspoken board member, stood in front of my house for almost 10 minutes one afternoon, arms crossed, fuming like a cartoon villain. I ignored him. The fence wasn't going anywhere. Eventually, I received a formal acknowledgement from the HOA. Not an apology, not even a concession. Just a short statement saying they had reviewed the matter and determined no further action would be pursued at this time. It was the most bureaucratic way of saying, you win. And oh, did that feel good. What followed was a quiet shift in the neighborhood. People started talking to me more. Some asked about the artists. Others asked if they could hire the same team to create something for their yards. A few homeowners who had been too afraid to cross the board started asking questions like, do you think I could put a sculpture in my garden? Or, what if I repainted my door a bright color? The mural had done what I'd hoped. It cracked open a door that had been shut for far too long. This wasn't just about me getting back at the HOA anymore. This was about changing the tone of the neighborhood, reminding people that rules shouldn't silence creativity and that community wasn't built through uniformity. It was built through expression. The HOA may have thought they'd get me to repaint a fence. Instead, they inspired a movement. When the HOA realized their polite requests weren't going to get me to dismantle my art installation, they dropped the gloves and went full-on panic mode. An emergency board meeting was announced, one of those dramatic, members-only affairs where the same dozen people sat in a circle pretending they spoke for the entire neighborhood. I wasn't invited, of course. But the whispers started before the chairs had even cooled. Word spread fast. Apparently, the board's main agenda item was a petition they wanted to circulate, one to restore visual harmony across the neighborhood. Their wording, not surprising coming from the same people who once fined a family for using purple mulch in their flower beds. The petition was their way of rallying support. They claimed my mural disrupted the visual cohesion of the community and set a dangerous precedent that could lead to an influx of non-compliant artistic displays. God forbid someone else get inspired and install something unique. Their goal was to pressure me publicly by making it seem like the entire community was behind them. Except, that wasn't exactly true. Yes, a few neighbors signed it right away. Most of them were the usual suspects, those who hated anything remotely unconventional. But when they went door to door, the results weren't what they expected. Many neighbors refused. Some even closed the door in their face. A few later told me they'd signed it just to avoid confrontation, then immediately regretted it. The irony? More people came by to compliment my fence than to criticize it. Still, a small but loud group seemed especially bitter. Not just the board members, but neighbors I thought were neutral. Turns out a few of them were jealous. One neighbor, Steve, who always bragged about having the best lawn on the block, told me the mural was tacky and that it drew too much attention away from the rest of the neighborhood. His tone made it clear. He wasn't mad about the fence. He was mad it made my house the new centerpiece of the community. Things escalated when 2 HOA board members came to my door unannounced. No email, no heads up, just a knock and 2 sour faces. They tried to be cordial at first, but it quickly turned into thinly veiled intimidation. One of them, Janice, actually said, "We can't allow your property to set an example that others follow." The other, Mike, chimed in with some nonsense about neighborhood integrity. I smiled, stepped back inside, and returned holding my phone, already recording. They didn't like that. "We don't consent to being recorded," Janice snapped. "Then don't come to my house without notice," I replied. They left in a huff, but not before muttering that they were considering legal action. That's when I decided to play a card I'd been holding close. The attorney. What the board didn't know was that weeks earlier, when they first began making noise about compliance and violations, I'd already consulted a civil rights attorney who specialized in HOA overreach. She reviewed the bylaws, the state regulations, and confirmed exactly what I suspected. They had no legal standing to force me to remove the mural. Not unless they wanted to be sued for discriminatory enforcement and selective rule interpretation. So, when the board followed up with a formal notice threatening litigation, I didn't panic. I responded with a calm, well-worded letter drafted by my attorney. It cited specific state laws about property rights, HOA limitations, and artistic expression. It also made it very clear, if they pursued legal action, we were ready to counter-sue for harassment and retaliation. The threat worked better than I anticipated. Within days, the HOA's lawyer reached out, not to fight, but to discuss potential resolutions. Their tone was suddenly less aggressive, more, "we're all neighbors here" energy. My attorney handled the conversation, but the message was clear. They didn't want a public legal battle they were likely to lose, especially not one that would attract media attention, considering the growing popularity of the fence and its buzz on social media. Then came the final twist, the property value claim. At another HOA gathering, one of the board members made a dramatic statement claiming my fence had lowered neighborhood property values. It was a bold claim, and one they clearly thought would win over the undecided. But what they didn't expect was for a local realtor, someone I'd sold a car to a year ago and kept in touch with, to publicly refute them. This realtor, Melissa, showed up at the next community Q&A meeting, pulled out her iPad, and presented data. Property views near my address had actually increased in the past few weeks. She explained that in today's market, unique homes with personality were becoming more desirable. She even called my mural a local landmark that made listings nearby more attractive because people remembered the area. You could have heard a pin drop. That was the moment things shifted for good. The HOA lost their narrative. No longer could they hide behind claims of property values or community standards. They were exposed for what they really were, control-obsessed gatekeepers clinging to a version of suburbia that didn't exist anymore. And I was just someone who painted a fence and accidentally started a movement. As the days passed without any further word from the HOA, I realized something incredible had happened. They had backed off. No more letters, no more door visits, no more threats disguised as community guidance. It was like they had collectively decided that pretending nothing happened was better than losing again. They knew they had pushed too far, and now, publicly bruised, they slunk back into their administrative holes. For the first time since I moved into the neighborhood, I didn't feel like I was constantly under surveillance. But the story didn't end there, because what started as a neighborhood dispute about a fence quickly became something much bigger. It began with a simple photo. A passerby took a snapshot of my fence and posted it on a local Facebook group with the caption, "Art in Unexpected Places." That post took off, shared hundreds of times within the community and then beyond. A local artist saw it and reached out, asking if I'd be willing to talk about the piece for an online gallery focused on public expression. I agreed, half out of curiosity, half out of vindication. Within a week, the gallery interview went live. Then a regional news outlet picked it up, publishing an article titled, "When the HOA Said No, This Resident Said Art." That headline alone caught fire. Suddenly, my inbox and DMs were full of messages from strangers, some laughing, others inspired, many of them sharing their own horror stories with power-hungry HOAs. People sent photos of fences, yards, mailboxes, and even garage doors they'd transformed as little acts of rebellion or beauty. I wasn't alone. I was part of something much bigger. But it wasn't just the internet talking. People started driving by, slowing down to look at the mural. Some would park and take pictures. One day, I walked outside to find a small group of local high school art students sketching the design into their notebooks. A few days later, I was contacted by the local arts council, inviting me to speak on a community panel about expression in residential spaces. I stood there, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about creativity and spoke not just about the mural, but about what it meant to push back against small-minded authority. I talked about how rules designed to maintain aesthetic harmony often silence individuality. And when I finished, the applause felt like more than just clapping. It felt like a turning point. The HOA couldn't ignore the wave. Their silence became awkward. The same people who once aggressively cited guidelines now pretended it had all been a misunderstanding. One even told me, off the record, that the board was quietly reviewing its rules around decorative structures. Apparently, they were now exploring how to encourage tasteful artistic installations, a complete reversal from the fines they threatened just weeks earlier. Meanwhile, I received another message, this time from a retired couple who had lived under a different HOA across town. Inspired by my story, they were planning to host a yard art walk and wanted my permission to feature my home as a stop. I said yes, without hesitation. That event ended up drawing dozens of attendees. My mural wasn't just decoration anymore. It was a symbol, a marker of a moment when someone said no to being controlled and yes to creating something bigger than themselves. Of course, not everyone loved it. There were still a few neighbors who refused to make eye contact when they passed by. Some acted like I'd committed a crime against their picket fence paradise. But even they couldn't argue with the results. The neighborhood hadn't fallen into chaos. If anything, it was more alive than ever. And then came the biggest surprise of all. A local museum, known for showcasing urban art, contacted me. They were putting together an exhibit called Everyday Canvases and wanted to feature a scaled recreation of my fence mural, complete with a short documentary clip about the HOA battle. I was stunned. What began as a clapback against neighborhood micromanagement had now become a museum piece. The irony was rich. I agreed, of course. And on opening night, I stood in that museum, surrounded by people photographing the replica, watching the short film, and discussing the deeper meaning of suburban conformity. One woman came up to me with tears in her eyes and said, "You made me feel brave. I'm going to repaint my whole front porch tomorrow." I never expected any of this. I never planned to go viral, spark conversations about community standards, or have a slice of my life turned into a museum installation. All I wanted was to push back, to say, "You don't get to decide what beauty looks like to me." And in doing that, I discovered just how many people feel the same way, but are too afraid to act. Now, when people walk past my house, they don't just see a fence, they see art, they see resistance, they see proof that creativity can outlast control. And somewhere behind their neatly trimmed hedges and faded HOA rulebooks, I hope the board finally realizes sometimes the best way to protect a neighborhood's character is to let it breathe. If this story made your jaw drop, just wait. There's so much more where that came from. Subscribe to the HOA Stories for true tales of neighborhood drama, unhinged HOA power trips, and the wildest revenge you've ever seen. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the notifications, and join the rebellion. Because here, we don't just tell stories. We expose the madness behind the picket fences.